Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are going to get started in just about 30 seconds. We're going to give folks a chance to get their audio set up. Hello, everyone. We are going to get started in just about 15 seconds. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar for February 28th, 2024. The webinar will be the 2024 State of the Child. My name is Joshua Long. I am the Senior Educational Content Manager here at IYI. We just want to start by thanking you so much for joining us for today's presentation. We are always grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers who remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and children. And so as we are kind of doing introductions here, if you could just go into the chat and introduce yourself and your organization so that we can get to know each other. For any technical support issues, use the chat feature to send a message, and Aaron Whitcomb, IYI's registration manager, is behind the scenes to assist you. Use this feature to converse with the group as well. You will be able to receive a copy of today's PowerPoint via email. We also encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any you may have, and we will get to as many as possible. And with the Q&A feature, you are able to upvote the questions that you most want answered. And so maybe somebody else thought of the same question, just go ahead and upvote it, and that will appear at the top of the questions. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And if you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of IYI's webinars, today's webinar will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion later or share the opportunity to listen in with partners. I'm very excited about today's presentation, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to IYI's own Ashley Haynes.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. Joining us from all across the state of Indiana. We're really excited to have you here for our 8th annual Indiana State of the Child webinar. As Josh said, I'm Ashley Haynes, Vice President of Data and Communications at Indiana Youth Institute, and I'm joined by my colleagues Bree Youn, IYI's Data and Research Manager, and Taylor Johnson, IYI's Policy and Data Advocacy Manager, both of whom you'll hear from in just a few minutes. We hope that you'll take what you learn here today and the connections you might make back to your communities and use the data to impact the kids that you see every day. But today is only the beginning. For the next 2 months, the IYI team will be traveling all across the state to share local county-specific youth wellbeing data. We hope to see you at one of those events too. While you're here today, as Josh mentioned, we invite you to add any questions into the question box. We will have some time to address them at the end of today's webinar. And I'm going to start off with an overview of the data from our 2024 Indiana Kids Count data book. Then I'll turn the majority of our presentation over to Bree and Taylor to dive into some state-level data. At IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on our youth. We do this by educating, equipping, and engaging others, and by bringing together audiences like this. Why do we do this work? It's because there was a time not long ago when we were children too. Do you remember your childhood? You see on the screen some of the IYI staffers. Some of them you might recognize when we were kids ourselves. Those were the days when we played with our friends, sold Girl Scout cookies, worked towards merit badges, and watched Saturday morning cartoons. Those are the days when anything seemed possible and the world was ours for the taking. What was your childhood dream? Take a moment, and then I would love to have you add that into the chat. What was your dream when you were a kid? For some, it might have been to play basketball for IU or Purdue, or football for Notre Dame. For others, it was to be an astronaut, a doctor, a teacher, or an IndyCar driver. For me, it was to be a veterinarian, a hairstylist, and an actress. We all wanted to walk across the graduation stage, receive a diploma, or travel around the world. We wanted to buy a house and have a family. We wanted friends, hobbies, and communities that felt like home. Now we want that for our next generation. We're here because we want every child to have those dreams. We want more of those dreams to come true. That's why we do this work. There are over 1.5 million children living in Indiana. Our younger generations are more diverse than our adult population, and they're inheriting a world very different from the one that we grew up in. Today, Indiana's young people face challenges we couldn't have imagined when we were growing up. Their lives were disrupted by a global pandemic. Classes were moved to Zoom, ball games and school dances were canceled, opportunities to make friends and find connections were delayed. And they've never known a time before smartphones and social media. They can use Google and artificial intelligence to help them with their homework, but they have less privacy and face more peer pressure than we did. They've grown up online, and that hasn't always been easy for them. Think of what young people will experience in their lifetime, though. They might live to see the cure for cancer or a person walk on Mars, and they might be the ones to do it. Think of what they'll experience, all the possibilities, the dangers, and the uncertainties. That's the purpose of IYI's State of the Child events. That's why these conversations are so important, to prepare Indiana's young people for what comes next. To do that, we need to know what they're going through today. That's where a better understanding of data and using it for action comes in. For the past 30 years, IYI has released the Indiana Kids Count Data Book as the Indiana affiliate of the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count Network. For 30 years, it's been the premier source of data and evidence on issues affecting our youth. The data we're sharing here today comes from our 2024 Indiana Kids Count Data Book that we just released last week, and it points us towards what we're doing right and where we can improve. I'm excited to share that Indiana has moved up to 24th nationally in the overall youth well-being rankings, according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation. That's up from 28th the year before. Also noteworthy, Indiana moved up in almost every category. We rank 13th for education, 16th for economic well-being, 29th for health, and 31st for family and community. There's much to be encouraged by in the data. Compared to the United States, the state of Indiana has fewer children living in poverty and fewer whose parents lack secure employment. And there's more good news. Food insecurity is down. The number of children without health insurance is down to 6%. And here in Indiana, we've seen a lower juvenile recidivism rate, fewer children in need of services, and fewer children living in foster care. We've also seen a decline of behaviors that we've long discouraged in our kids. The teen birth rate is in decline. So are the rates of underage drinking, vaping, smoking, and illicit drug use. Even more encouraging, the class of 2023, 88.9% of our students graduated from high school. That's the highest rate in Indiana since 2016 and the third highest since we've been tracking. Those are reasons to be hopeful. They are proof that we can move the needle and we can make a difference. That's why I can share here in Indiana, the state of the child is good, but not good enough. Thanks to the dedication of all of you attending today's webinar, Indiana did move up to 24th in the national rankings. But 24th is still the middle. It's just one up from a dead middle of 25. And we want what's best for Indiana's kids, and we should expect nothing less. So if Indiana's children aren't reading at grade level, if they're struggling with mental health, that's the responsibility of all of us. The state of the child is really a report card for adults. Think about what that means. Almost 80% of Indiana's high school students report spending 3 hours per day on screen time outside of their schoolwork. These younger generations have fewer friends than we did, and they're less likely to date. Instead, they're staying home and watching TikTok or playing video games. And they might lack purpose and direction. And as adults, we get on them about that. But they didn't create these problems. They're only mirroring what behaviors they see from us. Today's children are the reflection of the adults, around them and how we act. In the end, the state of the child is the state of our society. It's the state of our schools, our economy, and our healthcare system. It's what we tolerate and what we prioritize. That's why the work you do is so important, to set a good example, but also to be a point of connection for our kids, to interact with them instead of handing them a tablet, to have real conversations with our teenagers and give them real responsibilities. Because when we do, they're up to the challenge. We've dedicated our careers to serving kids in Indiana. Remember back again to your childhood. Today's children will have the same excitement that you did, and they'll face the same disappointments. They'll fail the big test, they'll get cut from the team, they might get dumped by their high school crush. But as youth workers, we can be there to listen to them. We can open new doors of opportunities, we can help kids overcome adversity, and we can teach them how to thrive. There's a saying, be the person who you needed when you were a child. And think about who that was for you. Most of us will never race in the Indy 500 or go to outer space. I didn't become a vet, a hairstylist, or an actress. Instead, we became and are still becoming the best versions of ourselves. And that's because of the people who are there for us, youth workers like you. The state of the child in Indiana is good, but it could be even better. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bree and Taylor to dive into the 4 domains of data that IYI tracks. They're going to also share an overview of how to access and use our 2024 data book and our 2024 interactive county dashboard. And then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end for Q&A, and I'll be back to see you for that.
Well, as Ashley just mentioned, we track several core domains here at IYI. And one of those core domains by which we group some of this data is family and community. One of the indicators that we track within this domain is the involvement of youth in the justice system. And while juvenile justice system was designed to operate with the recognition and the understanding that youth are fundamentally different from adults, research continues to point towards poorer outcomes for those juveniles who do come into the contact with the justice system, even briefly. And while juvenile case filings include nearly all things relating to family law or any legal proceedings involving a juvenile, when it comes to juvenile justice specifically, there are 2 case filing types that we want to examine more closely, and that is status and delinquency. Status cases, or cases filed only because of a child's age, include things like curfew violations, truancy, and underage drinking. These filings are not crimes, but are only being filed because of the accused status as a child. Delinquency cases are cases that are filed because of a juvenile allegedly committed an offense that would be considered a crime. Now, status case filings declined by 5% from 2021 and 2022, but still represented 16% of all Indiana case filings in 2022. Despite this decline in status case filings, delinquency case filings increased by 17% in the same time span and represented nearly 20% of all juvenile case filings. Now, like many states around the country, Indiana has made recent legislative changes that aim to address the juvenile justice issues. Many of these changes show promise in not only reducing juvenile involvement in the justice system, but also in improving outcomes for youth who are already involved in the justice system. And while many of these case filings can be addressed through things like community involvement, diversion programs, and probation, there are many filings that ultimately end up with the juvenile facing incarceration. In 2022, the number of juvenile new admissions increased 30% to 489, disrupting a steady decline in new admissions since 2016. Over a third of all new admissions in Indiana were for misdemeanor offenses, and less than half, or 47.4%, were person or weapon offenses. This shows us that the majority of juvenile new admissions in 2022 were for nonviolent and less serious offenses that may have been addressed through things like detention alternatives. Now, like the juvenile justice system, the foster care system is also designed to improve the welfare and the outcomes for youth who are placed in its care. And when the foster care system is operating with the safety, the development, and the best interests of the child in mind, the outcomes for children in foster care can be both positive and beneficial. We should also recognize, however, that the outcomes of the foster care involvement are not always positive for the child. And that's why we should continue the work of reducing the number of foster care placements here in Indiana. The latest data in 2023 shows us that the rate of children in foster care at some point has dropped by nearly 50% since 2018. Now, this decline is both welcome and in part attributable. In 2018, Congress passed a bipartisan bill called the Family First Prevention Services Act, or the Family First Act. And this bill was based on the research that shows us that children do their best and have greater success in life when they are able to remain with their family. And it placed an emphasis on providing the necessary supports and keeping families together when possible and safe. This legislation may likely have contributed to the decline that we see not just in foster youth, but in removals and in CHINS designations as well. Now, while foster care families play an important role in providing children with safe and nurturing environments, not all children outside of parental care make it into the foster care system. In many circumstances, grandparents are relied upon to temporarily care for or even raise their grandchildren. And due to the sudden and immediate need in some grandparent caregiver cases, many grandparent caregivers lack the support and the resources that are available to those who have gone through the foster care system. The chart on the screen currently shows several different characteristics of the 51,548 grandparent caregivers that were estimated to be in the state of Indiana in 2022. Resources and community support are vital components when it comes to assisting grandparent caregivers, because 16.5% of these caregivers live below the federal poverty line. Nearly 60% of grandparents responsible for their grandchildren are currently in the workforce. And research and studies suggest that many may eventually have to leave the workforce to provide for their grandchildren, while others may have returned to the workforce to afford the expenses that are associated with raising a child and providing care. Now, among these grandparent caregivers, 44.8% are providing care without the parent of their grandchild present.
As different scenarios occur in a child's life, we know that the caregiver for that child may also change. And while the mother may not always be the primary caregiver, it's clear that the health of the mother plays a pivotal role in the health of a child, especially at birth. The Maternal Vulnerability Index is a county-level nationwide tool used to identify where and why mothers in the U.S. are vulnerable to poor health outcomes. According to the MVI, Indiana is one of only 11 states in which maternal vulnerability is deemed to be very high. The Midwest region actually has the second highest overall vulnerability across all regions, and it holds the highest vulnerability gap between Black women and the regional average. So, what's included in MVI? Well, it measures 43 indicators associated with maternal health outcomes across 6 different themes. The 3 highest contributing themes to Indiana's MVI score are mental health and substance use, reproductive health care, and the physical environment in which they live. Just as these are top contributors to maternal mortality, they also heavily impact an infant's health outcome. In many ways, the health of a child is impacted and sometimes determined before they're even born. In fact, research has shown that the absence of consistent prenatal care can increase the risk of low birth weight babies and even death. Now, Indiana has consistently held an infant mortality rate higher than the US. Breaking that down even further, like the disparities present among mothers in Indiana, we see similar disparities in infant mortalities. Black and multiracial infants are nearly twice as likely to die after birth when compared to the state average, and are almost 3 times as likely to die before their first birthday when compared to white infants. Now, many of these tragedies, both maternal and infant deaths, are in part due to the limited access to the critical care that our counties just do not have available. And while we see that many counties across the state are lacking sufficient prenatal and natality care, like inpatient delivery services, which our data book further outlines, even more counties have a shortage in healthcare access, further widening the gap in receiving necessary care. Now, this year's data book includes 3 access to care related ratios: primary physicians, dentists, and mental health providers. These measurements are not child specific, but they do provide insight into the types of care children and their families have access to. Take, for example, the primary care physician ratio, which in 2022 was 1 physician for every 1,500 people in Indiana. This ratio is just one component in assessing healthcare shortages. It also includes things like poverty status and time spent driving to access that care. Now, I do want to pause here and point out that access does not always translate into the ability to receive these types of care. All right, so I just threw a whole lot at you at once, but what does all this mean, right? Simply put, 40% of Indiana's population was medically underserved across all three disciplines. When just examining mental health care access alone, data shows that 91 of Indiana's 92 counties face a mental health provider shortage, accounting for nearly 95% of our state's population, including children. Now, Indiana has taken steps in recent years to improve mental health care access. However, the shortage of access continues to be reflected in the data surrounding those youth who needed support but were unable to obtain it. It is estimated that more than 55% of youth in Indiana who had a major depressive episode did not receive the mental health services that were needed. Additionally, we're seeing concerning trends in the student-reported mental health data, specifically depression and suicide. According to the Indiana Youth Survey, 36% of students in 7th to 12th grade reported they felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in 2022, representing over a third of the 7th to 12th grade student respondents. Over 17% of students in the same grades reported that they seriously considered suicide. That's almost 1 in every 5 middle and high school students. These are our kids. These are kids in our neighborhood, our communities, our families, kids we work with every single day. Yet despite this, these 1 in 5 kids are still expected to show up to class every day. Many, as you can imagine, are suffering in silence. This data certainly paints a picture of the state of our youth that should make us take pause. And we're only just beginning to understand the impacts of our youth's mental health needs. It's important that youth workers, community members, and leaders throughout the state continue to expand the work being done to increase mental health access to all youth in Indiana.
And there's another access issue that is facing Indiana, and that's access to early childhood education. Indiana is one of 33 states where infant care is more expensive than college tuition at a 4-year public university. The estimated demand for early childhood programming in Indiana is nearly double the capacity for licensed providers. Of what is currently available, only half are high-quality providers. Childcare is both expensive and difficult to access for many families across Indiana. The average cost-to-income ratio of childcare for families here in the state is 10%, with several counties placing above the state average. And even for families who can afford childcare, supply does not always meet demand, leaving many families with few or no options. Now, the problem of childcare access and cost is often more challenging for those families who are living in poverty. For while resources are available to assist them in obtaining childcare, they're still not enough. Take, for example, this chart showing the percentage of parents receiving childcare for children ages 0 to 5 from others at least 10 hours a week. Now, in this example, others is defined as a daycare center, preschool, a Head Start program, a nanny, or another non-relative caregiver. And we see that less than half of parents, making less than 100% of the federal poverty level, could afford outside sources of childcare. Now, for reference, 100% of the federal poverty level in 2024 for a family or a household of 4 is just $31,200. For families making 100 to 200% of the federal poverty level, that would be right around $62,000, again, for a 4-person household, only 1/3 could afford outside sources of childcare. This means that parents who are either below the poverty level or above the poverty level, but still struggling to make ends meet and trying to find a living wage, are forced to make a choice: stay with their child and forego work opportunities, or seek out work opportunities without the assurance that their child is being cared for. Now, for any family living in poverty, we know that securing consistent and quality childcare is made that much harder by their financial position. We also know, however, that like many other of our tracked indicators, there are disparities that exist among who is more likely to experience poverty here in Indiana. Among households living in poverty in Indiana, 35%, more than a third, are single mother households. And we just touched on the difficulties that Hoosier families face when affording childcare, and we see here the cost burden of having a child. because nearly 60% of all households living in poverty have at least one child in the household. And based on available data, there is an inverse relationship between educational attainment and poverty status. The lower the education level, the greater the likelihood of poverty. And vice versa, the greater the educational level, the lower the likelihood of poverty. Among just youth, 16.1% of children under the age of 18 were living in poverty in Indiana in 2022. That's almost 250,000 children. And of these, nearly 250,000 children living in poverty, we know that children under the age of 5 have the highest rate of poverty when compared to any other age group. Among children living in poverty, 61% of children live in one of those single mother households that we just talked about. There are many challenges that coincide with poverty, too many to name here today. But among the top challenges for families is obtaining food that is quality, fresh, and nutritious. In Indiana, 12.9% of children are food insecure. That means that over 200,000 children in Indiana lack consistent or dependable access to enough food and nutrition so that they can live a healthy and active lifestyle. We know that children who experience food insecurity, even for a short time, can face developmental delays because they're unable to get the nutrition they need to continue growing. Now, food insecurity's prevalence and its impacts are not just limited to those families below the poverty threshold. In fact, 23% of food insecure children are ineligible for federal nutrition programs like WIC because their household income is at or above 185% of the federal poverty level. Now, children living in households with incomes at or above that same threshold are not eligible for reduced lunches under the National School Lunch Program. Fortunately, the majority of food insecure children in Indiana are eligible for programs like SNAP, WIC, and the National School Lunch Program. And for many children, school is one of the few places where they can receive consistent and nutritious meals. There are youth in our state, though, who desperately need the assistance of such programs, but they're not in school and they're not in the labor force. These youth, young adults ages 16 to 24, are called opportunity youth. In total, 11.6%, or 97,000 of these youth, were neither attending school nor were they working. And while we have fewer of our youth here in Indiana who aren't in school and, again, not working than the national average, the makeup of these youth in the state is disproportionate. Black youth represent nearly 1 in 4 opportunity youth in the state. These youth are more likely to experience poverty and to end up in the criminal justice system, and they deserve better opportunities.
One of the ways to expand opportunities for our youth, both in short term and later in life, is through providing quality education that will set them up for future success. This begins with increasing attendance and reducing the number of absences students have. We know that Indiana is not alone in seeing a sustained and elevated rate of chronic absence among students. Data strongly points to COVID as a likely, or at least the largest contributor to the increase shown across the state. As conditions have steadied and returned to a new normal, we have yet to see a corresponding drop or even return to rates prior to the pandemic. 1 in 5 children were chronically absent in 2023. And while, yes, that's slightly down compared to the previous year, it's still tracking over 8% higher than pre-COVID levels. What does that look like? Well, for 84 Hoosier schools, over half of their students were reported to be chronically absent. In other words, they missed at least 10% of their academic year. Now, if you've attended any of our data presentations in the past, you know that we are big advocates for disaggregated data. By understanding the who behind the numbers, we're better able to uncover disparities and highlight gaps that exist within the data. Here on the slide, you'll see chronic absence rates within the different student populations. Among these various populations, we see that Black students displayed the highest level of chronic absence, more than 10% higher than the state average. Across all race and ethnic student populations, only Asian and white students had a rate that fell below the state average. Another gap that became apparent was lower income students. Students who received free and reduced price meals were nearly twice as likely to be chronically absent than their peers who were not eligible. When a student is chronically absent, they miss out on vital classroom time that can permanently impact their grades, test performances, and even reading proficiency. We know this, right? We know this. But how do we know this? in part because we're seeing nearly identical disparities among the same student populations in the assessment data. Take iRead as an example here on the screen. If you look beyond the overall proficiency rate for the state, which is displayed here as a line across that chart, you'll see that again, Asian and white students were the only two race and ethnic student populations that held a higher than average reading proficiency. Highlighted here in red, only 2/3 of Black, Hispanic, and English learner students are proficient in reading. Over a quarter of students that received free and reduced price meals have not achieved a passing score. In other words, they're unable to read and understand grade level text. Just as a student's absence can be used as a predictor of their grades and academic success, so can a student's reading proficiency. In fact, a student's third grade reading ability is considered a major contributing indicator to high school graduation. Why is that? Students unable to read at a grade level before the end of third grade are 4 times less likely to graduate than their reading proficient peers. Now, as you heard from Ashley earlier, we do have a little bit of great news. The class of 2023 saw the highest graduation rate since 2016, which is huge. 88.9% of our students graduated from high school last year, an increase of 2.3% from the previous year. Yet, and this is a big yet, friends, despite this, we continue to see that not all student populations throughout the state are seeing this increase. Looking beyond the aggregated data, we see that while yes, the overall graduation rate increased from 2022 and did so among every other racial and ethnic group, the graduation rate of American Indian and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students actually declined from the previous year. 1 in 4 American Indian and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students did not graduate in 2023. Furthermore, Asian and white students were the only two race and ethnic student populations that held a higher graduation rate than state average. The graduation rate as a whole serves not only as a temperature check on how our education system and schools are doing, but as a predictor of college enrollment. Research shows that students who do not graduate on time or just drop out altogether are less likely to enroll in college, even if they obtain a GED later in life. Now, a little over half of Indiana's 2021 graduating cohort enrolled in college. And while this is only slightly less than the previous year, it's the 7th consecutive cohort to see a decline. And as you can see here on the chart displayed, students who earn an honors diploma exhibit the highest college going rate of almost 85%. Not only that, but it's the only diploma type to exceed the state average. We also continue to see elevated college enrollment among students earning dual credit while in high school, nearly doubling the rate of college enrollment among their peers that did not. Asian and white students are the only two race and ethnic student populations that continue to enroll in college at a higher rate than the state average, which further correlates with the academic proficiency and achievement gaps found in all 3 data indicators I previously touched on. So now what? Well, one of the first steps to ensure that children in Indiana receive a quality education is making sure that they're able to regularly attend school. Education is a compounding process. From early learning programs all the way to doctorates and PhDs, we build upon what we've learned and what we know. And that process at its very core begins with equipping students with the necessary resources to be able to show up.
Just as it's important that students show up, it's also important that all of you have shown up here today. Your attendance on the 2024 State of the Child webinar today expressly shows that youth workers in Indiana continue to be dedicated, passionate, and tireless when it comes to improving the lives of youth throughout Indiana. So thank you all for taking time today to join us in exploring and better understanding the state of children in Indiana. And to make sure that we're respecting your time and equipping you with the right data, we encourage you to add in any questions you may have into the Q&A box that you'll find that was already identified at the top of this webinar. And we'll spend some time here in just a few minutes answering some of those questions. Now, while you're submitting those questions, we do want to walk through some changes that you'll see in this year's data book and show you how to access our county dashboard. But first, to access the data book, you can either scan the QR code on the screen, or you can visit iyI.org, and in the navigation bar under Data, you'll see the Indiana Kids Count Data Book option, and that link will take you directly to the page where you can download a copy of the book. Now, one of the new and probably most noticeable additions in this year's book is the inclusion of county-specific data for every one of our key indicators. In years past, we've heard feedback from many of you, highlighting the importance of knowing how your county is doing concerning an indicator that might be germane to your mission or your intent in your community. Now, state level data is important and it's great, but county level data tells a story with a bit more detail, and it can be a better gauge of the impact of the work that you're doing in your community. And so with the inclusion of county level data for each indicator, we're also able to provide rankings for each of those indicators as well. Now, it's important to briefly talk about the intent of what those rankings are. These rankings are not intended to turn indicators into county by county competitions, and they're not intended to point fingers or disparage work being done in any county or community. But instead, they're intended to show not just how your county is doing, but how other communities are doing. There's a lot of great work that's being done throughout the state. And to address some of the indicators that we just discussed, it's important for us to know and recognize how each of our counties are doing. And these rankings allow all of us to identify the strengths and weaknesses that are present all across our state. They also allow for cross-collaboration, so that perhaps you may be able to reach out to your counterpart in a county with a higher ranking and see what they're doing that may be contributing to their relative success. One of IYI's values is working together. And one of the ways to do that is by sharing what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what has promise. And so to that point, you'll also see that several of our indicators contain data in action. And these provide actionable steps and promising practices. And these can be used as a template to change the associated data point. In the spirit of working together and bringing best practices to youth workers throughout the state of Indiana, each promising practice provides an example of a program, a policy, or maybe even a legislative change that has shown some effectiveness in improving the lives of children. Now, when an indicator has changed in your community, you'll see that we have directional arrows to indicate that. And those directional arrows are also accompanied and color-coded. So green means an indicator has improved, red means an indicator has declined, and yellow is no change. And you'll see the same thing in the directional arrows. An up arrow means an indicator has increased, a down indicator means it has decreased, and an equal sign means there has been no change from the previous, most recently available data. Now, it is possible for an up arrow in one indicator to be green, and it's possible for the very next key indicator to have an up indicator and be red. And that's because each indicator is shown the improvement or the increase of the data on its own merit. So it's possible that and I expected that some data we want to increase and some data we want to decrease in what we're trying to calculate here. Now, to access our county dashboard, which I know many of you are probably familiar with last year, you're going to start by visiting iyyi.org, and you'll see our home page. I'm going to start this video here. This moves quickly, so I'm going to pause it as needed. You'll see there under the navigation bar where it says data. I mentioned that previously. If you hover over that, you see county dashboard. You click on that and you'll find that our county dashboard is actually embedded directly on our website. So we've eliminated the step from last year where you had to click a button that would take you to the dashboard. Now the dashboard is directly on the web page and it's fully interactive as usual. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see 3 dots. And at the very bottom, if you click that, that'll take you to full screen. And the navigation between the pages on the dashboard, just like last year, can be found at the bottom. And you can toggle left and right to navigate between all the pages. Our wiggling boxes have made a comeback. They contain the year and the source data. And here I'm going to pause it. This is a county dashboard, and so it would make sense that all 92 counties are represented. So if you click on the Indiana, the bar where it says Indiana, a drop-down menu appears, and that contains all 92 counties, and you will see that the data will change depending on which county you select. So for this purpose, we're going to keep it on Indiana. But you also find that it's incredibly interactive. So hovering over graphics and visuals or clicking on graphics and visuals, a bit more detail. So I'd encourage you to play around with that functionality. At the top of each page, you'll see several boxes containing state level data. And this way you can always see how your county is doing when compared to the state data. You don't have to switch back and forth between how your county is doing and how the state's doing. And this remains true for each indicator across the page. Every box at the top is state data, and what that will not change depending on which county you select. The only thing that will change depending on the county you select are the visuals that you see at the bottom, and those are generally color-coded to match the domain. So your own, I highly encourage you to visit the dashboard. Again, you can scan that QR code that's on your screen, or you can visit iyy.org. And again, that's found under the data tab in the navigation bar. So I'd encourage you to familiarize yourself with all the features and the data that we have published on our dashboard and in the data book, of course. So now I know we've given you some time to put some questions in the chat, and I would like to invite the Vice President of Data Communications back in to kind of help us moderate and ask us these questions. Ashley Haynes.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Bree. Happy to be back. I always learn a tremendous amount anytime that I listen to or talk to either of these two about the data related to our youth. So we've had a number of questions that have come into the chat. We'll get through to as many of them as we can. Some of them we may not be able to answer. Some of the questions may be beyond the scope of the work that IYI does, but we'll do our best to answer the questions that you have been submitting. One note before we dive into the questions, the data that you'll see in the dashboard, in the county, in the data book, and any of IYI's other data products, that is not data that IYI collects firsthand. So we source our data from a number of public and state agencies. So that is also the reason why some of the data questions that you have about disaggregation and what we're able to track, we may not be able to answer, but Bree in particular will be able to answer them, some of them to the best of her abilities. Okay, I'm gonna start out with our first question. This came into the chat during the mental health section. So the question was about how we can estimate or learn more about the youth mental health data that is not officially tracked or reported, especially for areas where we have a gut feeling that the issues or how our kids are doing might be deeper than what the data is sharing. So Bree, for this question, can you talk a little bit about the Indiana Youth Survey, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and how our youth workers across the state can help support getting more of that information about how our kids are doing?
Yeah, certainly. So currently, and they're not the only source of data right now, but currently, two of the biggest sources is the Indiana Youth Survey and the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. There are two different surveys put on. One is done by the Department of Health and one is done by Prevention Insights, Taylor. Perfect. My suggestion would be connecting with both organizations to really help support those efforts, because participation rates is vital for both to be even put out, even have some sort of foundation. So that's my first recommendation. My second recommendation is partnering, similar to what we do, partnering with organizations in your community, because, well, there's not necessarily concrete data on everything. There could be, right? Especially as mental health is growing and what we know about mental health is growing for youth. There's always an opportunity or a venue to measure that. And there's always an organization that's likely wanting to do it too, or already doing it, and we just don't know about it. So that would be my second suggestion, partnering with organizations, even schools as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bree. A family and community data domain related question. Where do we source, from what agency do we source our information on CHIN's cases?
Yep. So that's Indiana Department of Child Services. And I also saw the follow-up question to that. We actually track state, or they give us state fiscal year data. So it's not calendar year, it is state fiscal year.
And you also see in all of the pages in our data book, either under the data visual or the chart, there is a data source line. And then also at the end of the data book, you'll find the full list of sources and citations for everything that you find in there. The data that we include and share in our data book and our other data products is the most currently available data. Some of it may be from 2023. For some of the indicators, the most current available data may be from 2021. So make sure that when you're looking at the different pages and parts of the data book, that you're checking out what year the data is referring to, because it may not be the same across all of the indicators. Okay. A couple of education questions came in, and some of these I know that Bree's going to be excited to talk about. Is the English language learner third grade reading proficiency adjusted to account for their fluency in their native language?
Yeah, so we have not dived into that, so I can't really answer that for sure. We get general numbers from Department of Education with the ELL students, so if they're categorized as ELL learners, that's the data that we get. So as far as being adjusted or weighted, no, not in our data.
A couple of disaggregated questions about the data. Is there disaggregated Asian data recognizing the disparities between Asian subgroups? And this was a education related question, but if there's other, I know there's changes in some of the census reporting that where you've talked about before, if you want to talk a little bit about some of that race and ethnicity disaggregation.
Yep. So the biggest source I think we all know is census, right? When it comes to race and ethnicity. And I'm super excited to first and foremost, I absolutely appreciate this question. And I love this question because I think it's absolutely needed. You have great points. If you think about Indiana too, we have one of the biggest Burmese populations, but their experiences, especially as a student, would be much different than other Asian ethnicity, Asian populations. So definitely needed. I agree with you. I'm super excited to share that I was on a call with Census earlier in the year that they will be working towards disaggregating their race and ethnicity populations out even further to include more of those subpopulations. So that's super exciting. I hope with that change then agencies will follow through and kind of mirror that. So super exciting. As far as the state agencies, not that we know of, but again, very likely could happen because the census is taking initiative to do so. So yay.
Wonderful. Next question, this is also related to education. Is there data on high school graduates that participate in apprenticeships or other non-college related career options?
That one I'm going to let Taylor talk about.
Yeah, so this is something that we talk about a lot, both Bree and I internally, as well as when we have conversations. And I know the question was focused on, there are vocational pathways that are certainly being offered to youth who exit immediately out of high school into one of those vocational pathways. The trouble is that because it's such a varied course, like there is no central agency that is tracking when a high school student graduates and immediately enters the workforce, either as an electrician or a plumber or a union worker. So there is no central agency that reports to those. I will say the governor's workforce cabinet is a great resource, and the Department of Workforce Development does a lot of labor tracking. It does not, it's not youth specific, and it does not always, again, it doesn't track straight out of high school, but it does give us some insight into the growth in different professions, whether those are, again, like we talked about, some of those vocational or the more traditional office jobs that we see. So you can use both of those resources to provide some information. I would caution you to not rely on those because they are not youth specific. But we always advocate, and hopefully you'll hear Bree and I say this at every event and webinar, we always advocate for greater sources of data. We always want the best information that we have available to us. So if you know of something that does track youth data, again, straight out of high school into those vocational pathways, we would love to connect with you on that. And we're always on the lookout for things like that.
Okay. Another education related question, and hopefully I'm going to be asking this one correctly. I'm going to make sure that I read it correctly, and then Bree or Taylor, whichever one of you feels most confident in feeling it. So this is about the impact of high school graduation students, high school graduation rates of students that fall out of the data, such as disenrolled for homeschool or unhoused students that can no longer be monitored. While the increase in graduation rates is amazing, what percentage of the increase might be due to students that are falling through the data tracking cracks?
That one I could probably speculate, but I think Bree could probably answer that a little better than I could.
Honestly, though, I'm kind of the same too. Because we get the general graduation rates, we also get dropout rate too, but we also know that those are not the only two venues in. It seems like you know that as well. So it's something that we as an organization are definitely going to dive in further to. now knowing, yes, this is a great thing. We have seen the biggest increase since 2016 and the second or third, I think it's second, right, Taylor? Largest since the data has even been tracked, which is huge. But what does that mean? So as an organization, we're definitely going to dive further into it. Do we have that answer yet? No. I love that you want that answer, Martha. So do I. So stay tuned.
Okay. Taylor, this question is for you. Can you talk about the sections in our book a little bit more? I know you mentioned them about that are called data in action, kind of what you can do, and promising practices.
Absolutely. So I think data is always going. We want as much data, and there's a ton of data out there. I think the one thing that really makes data to be such an important resource is to make sure that we can act on it. It should inform the decisions that we make, and we need to be able to do something with the data. It shouldn't just live on the pages of the data book. It should be brought to life through the work that all of you are doing such great work in your communities. And so it should be actionable. With that in mind, we've included, and this has been various iterations in past data books, but this year it's a little bit different. So we always provide for several indicators that in the data in action, a little context. All of this data should be actionable, right? But why did we focus on the ones that we've provided for you in the book this year? And there's 2 per domain, so you'll see 8 across the book. We provide a little context as to why this kind of rose to the level for us to extrapolate and to focus on it with a little bit more diligence as bringing it up to that data in action component. So we provide what's going on, recent developments, current events as it pertains to the data. And then with each one of those, we also provide actionable steps because, again, data should be actionable. And those steps will range from local steps that you can take, state steps that you can take, as well as federal action that you might be able to take. And we know that your sphere of influence is going to be different for each and every one of you and each and every one of your organizations. And so we wanted to make sure that we tried to capture as many action items as possible. And these are not prescriptive. So we're not saying that if you do this, X will happen. But it's a good starting place. And we want you to take those action items and adapt them. And in that spirit, we also provide promising practices, which I know I touched on a little bit. These are things that have been done in communities, not just in Indiana, but also around surrounding states, but across the country as well, and states that are very similar to Indiana. Actions that have been taken through programmatic changes, policy changes, legislative changes that have really been tied back to changes that they've seen in the data. So again, these are not, if you do this, X will happen, but they have a lot of promise. There is literature and research that suggests doing something similar to what we identified in the promising practice, understanding that every community is different. The state is different than the other state that we might be highlighting. But they're a good starting point, and they kind of get your mind working of what would that look like here in our community? What would that look like here in the state of Indiana? So hopefully these are resources that you're able to use as you continue to further your work and your mission and engage with this actionable data.
Okay, we've got time for just a couple more questions. So we won't be able to get to everything that's been submitted, so I'm going to get to a couple more in these next few minutes. This next one is related to the pandemic. I'm concerned what data will show in the next couple of years, given all the pandemic assistance that has gone away and Medicaid has returned to normal. What are areas where we might be in particular risk of losing traction, or areas that maybe seem to be the most impacted in what we've seen post-pandemic?
Bree, do you want that one, or?
I'll start it. You can finish it because we could go. Okay. First and foremost, I am a firm believer. We're definitely going to see it. I mean, it's a no-brainer. Education. We know that educational outcomes for youth. And you're spot on. We are going to see that in the next coming years. So that's the biggest that I would say. I definitely think there's more in health that Taylor, you want to touch on?
Yeah, you know, there are several things in health. We know whoever asked the question, sorry, I don't know your name, was asking specifically about Medicaid, the whole unwinding process of Medicaid. That's something that personally I've been tracking because we know that children who have insurance have better health outcomes generally than those who do not have insurance. Research has shown us that. And we talked about there are federal assistance programs that have been phasing out. One of the things that came alongside COVID was childcare access funding. And so when we talk about the childcare cliff, that's something the funding has been phased out or is being phased out in several states. And we see that the access for childcare is tight, the demand is high. And so that's something that could be changing as those programs start to dissipate. So there are several, too many to really dive into here, but for sure, those COVID-related relief programs and even outcomes directly tied to COVID. I know Bree talked about education, kids not in school. There are several that are kind of on the top of our list. But again, we always appreciate input and experiences that you are finding on the ground as well.
Yeah, I think another big one is also the family dynamic too, right? You're having children now care for other family members or younger children in their house. And then you're also talking about like the financial makeup of a household is obviously going to change, right? So there's also those aspects of it too. So the overall household makeup is definitely going to change, and we're going to see that through census data.
Thank you. All right, there's two more general questions that I'll be able to answer. While I'm doing that, Taylor, can you take it to our last slide where folks got the QR code to download the data book and to take our survey again? That was one of the questions that was in the chat. So there are those QR codes for both the survey and the data book. And as Josh mentioned, and he'll come back on and share a little bit more about next steps as well. Okay, two general questions. One was how far back should we use data and if the research is still relevant, but 20 years old, is that still something that can be sourced? So in general, when we talk about data and research at IYI, we're talking about those in two slightly different ways. So data, we are always looking at the most currently available data. So that may be 2023, might be 2022, 2021, some of them even maybe 2020, maybe the most currently available data set. And we always look at that in comparison and in context with another piece of data, whether that's looking year to year, area to area, or comparing some sort of factor so that there's context to just a single number that you're looking at. In terms of research, by and large, we try to use research that is within the past 4 years. There may be some research that are longitudinal studies that may be longer term than that, but generally, as an organization, we're trying to stick with the most current both data and research. And then one of the questions in the chat was about custom data requests and what can be requested. Those of you that have been a part of the IYI network for a number of years may be familiar with those. And if you are, then you may also notice that when Taylor showed the demonstration of the county dashboard, that IYI's website has also gotten a recent update. So as part of our website update this past fall, our goal was to make data more available, more on demand for you to use. And so as part of that, we have the data book, we have the dashboard, but we're also adding relevant research and direct data sets onto our website now. And so in that availability of data, we are no longer doing individual custom data requests. So there is a box, an email box at the very bottom of the data page where if there is something that you're looking at, we do encourage you to submit what you're looking for, and that may be something that we're able to do research and add into a future data book at some point, depending on what's available. And with that, Josh, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, team. I'm just going to put up 2 slides very quickly as we finish. So the first one is we strongly encourage you to stay in touch with us, and the best way to do that is by following our newsletter. They are weekly, they are a quick read, and they will provide you with all the information about IYI that you need for upcoming events. Additionally, I wanted to highlight 2 events that we have coming up in the next few months. We do not have a March webinar. We did 2 in February, so we're taking the month of March off. Our next webinar will be April 17th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And that is going to be supporting neurodiverse youth through executive function development, which should be pretty good. And then on May 7th, all day, we have our Advancing Equity Summit. That is an event that we do every year that is well attended, and we pull in some great presentations and great speakers. So we highly encourage you to attend that as well. And so as we conclude, I want to thank our attendees who joined us today. We appreciate your impact and value your voice and the choice you made to learn and partner with IYI. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about the presentation. If you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk as it may be there. And once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of completion. And so with that, we are going to conclude our presentation. So to our IYI folks that presented, thank you so much. And on behalf of Indiana's youth, thank you all so much for showing up today and every day for Indiana's youth.